Great. So, hello. Today we're going to be talking about scenario planning for 2021. And I wish I could tell you that today's seminar was going to be telling you exactly how 2021 will play out and let you put your feet up safe in the perfect knowledge that you know what will happen. But as we all know, we're in the realm of extraordinary uncertainty. And so instead, what I'm going to do is give you some tools that we've developed to try and help you look at your planning approach through a different perspective, to try and make sure that your organization's in a resilient as possible position to face whatever uncertainty 2021 holds. I last spoke about scenario planning to the sector back in May, when we were looking at different times in the year when theatres might be able to reopen their doors in some form, and we spoke about then theatres reopening in July, November, January or May 2021, and it seems like in parts all different parts of those scenarios have come true, and I think the point is not for these to be a prediction, but for these to be a lens through which you can view possible futures. A lot of theatres who we've been speaking to have been working on a most likely scenario basis of having what they think is most likely or a reasonable worst case scenario. But as you'll probably become all too familiar, reasonable worst case scenarios don't necessarily mean what the worst case might be, and don't necessarily prepare us for a broad range of options. We've found that people have had to change quite quickly with shifting regulations, and on an operational level, that's likely to continue. But we think that organisationally, theatres can be better prepared for what might be shifting priorities over the course of the coming year. This is step one on the journey towards a more resilient approach to planning, and we expect that it will emerge and develop, and we're very happy to work with theatres to try and help them be in the best possible place. So we've chosen spring 2021 as a point to begin our thoughts. Throughout this, we've seen a moving cliff edge of when we think theatres will hit moments of crisis. We were all kind of geared up, prepared for September of this year to be a point with the job retention scheme due to end, and with uncertainty around the funding and the restrictions in place around September. So but now with the Cultural Recovery Fund coming through, has shifted for a lot of theatres what that kind of critical moment is through to spring 2021. And the sorts of ideas we're talking about are the year from spring 2021 onwards. We know a few things about what's going to be happening in spring 2021. We know that there is a vaccine being rolled out for coronavirus, but we do not know the timescale of that. We know that there's a further round of the Cultural Recovery Fund in England, certainly to do with helping organisations prepare to face 2021. The Cultural Recovery Fund funding previously only allowing reflation of reserves up to 6 weeks for the up to 2021. But we don't know what restriction schemes will be in place in any of the nations. Certainly the English regulations with the tier system is due to expire around the 20th of March next year. So we don't really know what the restrictions landscape is, and we don't know the outcome of research that's ongoing about what what ventilation might be able to do to mitigate the spread further. This is not going to be a technical session about what theatres can do for reopening. We've previously looked at that with a different seminar, which is available on our website, called Reopening Stories. And that also looks at what theatres have done to reopen. So this is more forward-looking and about questioning what worlds might we be in and what do we need to prepare for. So the basics of scenario planning are about building multiple possible worlds. The central focus is going looking through the lens of where will we be, where might we be in a year's time, or in a longer period of time. And it's a creative exercise, which requires you to really reflect on your specific context of an organization. Today's a brief introduction of how that could be useful. It's based on an idea that many possible worlds could exist. The philosophical view of modal realism, or if you're into comic books, the multiverse, is an idea of saying there's lots of different possible worlds that we could be in. It's worth examining what they might be, so that we're better prepared for them. Certainly, there's a great deal of uncertainty that if the way the world has changed to now, the way the world is now, is not something that would have been predicted on anybody's scenario plans 3 or 4 years ago. Although there are certainly some things that we could have been prepared for, that we could be prepared for long-term closures for whatever reason, for those kind of emergency disaster relief, those sorts of things. So it's about tooling us up to be able to face things even when we don't know what those things might be. A basic principle is that over time uncertainty arises. I don't think this is a controversial idea. In 5-10 years time, we'll be in a world very different to the world we're in now, and that's the case at all times. And then the idea usually is that scenario planning is useful on a kind of in that point in time when you don't know what the world will be. So often when I've done scenario planning exercises in the past, I've been looking at organizations, looking at where will we be in 5 or 10 years time. But with the speed of change, the rapid and rapid uncertainty we're in now, that scenario, that window, that horizon has changed a lot. So I'm breaking a lot of the rules of what scenario planners will normally tell you by doing something that looks at such near future. But I think it's still a useful tool in trying to find the worlds that are applicable. So why are we scenario planning? We're doing it to, it's not intended as a replacement for your normal business plan, your normal budgeting process. And it's not about two ends of the spectrum. It's not about best case and worst case. And that's why we're going to come to recommending you exploring 4 different scenarios. Because often we find that people explore just 2 scenarios, then you'll have what if everything goes wrong and what if everything goes right. And all that does is feed pessimism and optimism, and doesn't really drill down to, well, what are the things that we're not considering in our business planning at the moment. You might use this approach to test your budget or risk register. We wouldn't recommend you building a specific budget for each scenario, because these are only a selection of infinite possible worlds. The point of it is to just stress test the ideas that already exist in your business plans, and to tread the paths that you might be forced to face before the moment when you're forced to face them. We've seen a lot of kind of swerves that organizations have had to make, and kind of we're encouraging you to be in a stronger position to face what are an extraordinary number of unknowns. So we've tried to create a scenario that are plausible versions of possible future. Coronavirus will not disappear overnight, but we do know there's a vaccine rollout. So we're in with that kind of, there are some constraints around what our scenarios might consider. If we prepared a separate response to every different possible variable, and this is just some of them that I've thrown up here, I've deliberately tried to put them up there in a way that you aren't going to try and scribble them down, and they're all in the handout anyway as well. But if we prepared a separate one for each of these possible outcomes, then we'd still be planning well into the mid-decade, and the opportunity to be prepared will have passed. Our approach has been to create 4 worlds which you can accept or adapt, or not to give a prediction, but to ask what if. I'd be surprised if off the shelf these were useful to you. They need to be adapted to your scenario and what are the key unknowns that you have. And it's really about telling a story about what is this possible world that you could find yourselves in. One of my colleagues apocryphally described these as the 4 horsemen, and that's really not what I want. I don't want these to be considered kind of doom mongers. It's important to identify opportunities in each of these possible worlds and not just wallow in what's going to be a challenging year, regardless of the path that it takes. we filtered down all of these different unknowns into two main variables, which we thought encapsulated and responded to the others. So the first we'll talk about is willingness of audiences to return. A major variable, which may not be constant throughout the year. It could be that we have a spike when theatres are able to reopen as people rush back, but then people might take a step back and be less willing to return. And that could be on economic grounds, it could be on their own perception of safety. And it could, and there are many kind of demographic factors as well. It might be that your audience particularly is very nervous about returning. The After the Interval survey that happened, that's previously happened by Indigo, if you've not come across that, is a very useful piece of work that looks at what sort of time scale people will be interested, able to return, and kind of mentally prepared to return to the theatre in, and what are the issues that they will need to have addressed in order for them to be comfortable about returning. The second point is about how quickly restrictions are eased. We wanted these scenarios to be resilient against sudden announcements. So rather than specifically putting a figure on if a certain capacity is able to attend or anything like that, we've plotted these as whether restrictions are eased quickly or slowly. Rather than limiting the thinking to specific capacity limits, we wanted them to be relevant, and we also wanted it to be relevant to the 4 different national approaches. You might, in your kind of crunching of these ideas, want to apply some harder numbers to it, understanding your organisation and the kind of where those where the crossing of a viable capacity lies. Also embedded within the idea of the easing of restriction speed is the consistency of those changes. A complete lifting of restrictions to be followed by a prolonged lockdown would still count as a slow easing of restrictions in our view. Obviously these two things aren't independent of each other, and both serve as a proxy of the prevalence of coronavirus in the public perception. But we felt like they were important enough and separate enough to be able to create different worlds on the basis of them. There are a lot of variables that could be inferred from these, but also some of them independent. I think if your organisation is specifically going to be affected by Brexit and international touring, or if there's a specific realm about a specific issue about how willing audiences are to pay for digital content, then you might want to inject some of that into your stories about each of these different outcomes to try and consider a world that's relevant to your organisation. So using these 2 key variables as our axes, we've come up with a model of 4 scenarios. I'll return to each of them later in detail, but to give a general overview here, we've got risky business, which sits in a realm of the restrictions lifting faster than audiences are willing to return. So you have uncertainty about whether your shows are viable on a kind of an economic basis, but there's very little additional support available because the brakes have been taken off from a regulatory point of view. There's a fast return, which has been pitched by many people as the optimistic response. But I think once we couch that in the realms of realism, we come up against issues of realistically how quickly can the organisation, the sector, rev up to being at full capacity, and what might we overlook if we're fast back to reopening? Is there changes that fail to happen, and are we missing out a kind of a sector of our audience in doing that? The long haul is a challenging one, and that's the one about organisations not being able to reopen consistently. It's about a constant world of lockdowns recurring, and a year where it's very difficult to do any kind of planning ahead. And this is a point about questioning what's the medium-term repurposing of a building and your resources to be able to be in a position to reopen when able to, but protecting the organisation and the buildings and its assets in the meantime. And then negotiating the system is is a world where the audiences are very willing, are very keen to get back, but their restrictions are preventing that. And the ways in which, the innovative ways in which organisations will need to work to create productions and create work around the restrictions. So in order to talk you through our interpretation of some of these worlds, then we've created a selection of example theatres. These are completely imaginary theatres. They're not anonymised versions of existing theatres. We've worked with a wide range of different chief executives of theatre organisations to flesh them out, but they aren't supposed to be one specific theatre. And it's unlikely that any of these theatres will be identical to your organisation. They've been included as characters for us to place in each of these possible futures and help sort of tell their story. So the first one of those is the Grand Theatre, a receiving house which seats 1,200. It's an established part of the touring circuit. It's in a mid-sized city. Up until now, it was presenting touring plays and musicals interspersed with TV comedians and heritage music acts. In the last 10 years, the operation has been outsourced to a trust, but it maintains a strong link to the local authority and receives a small subsidy from them. The Cultural Recovery Fund was the first time this theatre received any Arts Council funding, and some of the additional council funding has been made available to support the security and maintenance of the building. The theatre director and building manager, the only staff not furloughed since the building closure, and some marketing box office staff are still working but on reduced hours. There have been a number of job losses, but a core team remains furloughed to allow the theatre to reopen when able. The theatre doesn't have any content to digitise, it's fully a receiving theatre, and so the focus has just been on rescheduling and refunding bookings. Future bookings depend really heavily on the producer confidence in order to return, and there's a plan to refurbish, but the reserves set aside towards that have been reallocated during the closure. The second character is the Playhouse, a producing theatre with 600 seats and a small studio in a mid-sized town. It's a national portfolio organisation of the Arts Council. Recently, the number of productions at this theatre have fallen prior to the coronavirus, and it's now part of a network of co-producing theatre. It presents touring work of other national portfolio organisations and has been under pressure to reduce its dependency on subsidy. It started to increase earned income through private events prior to the coronavirus. There's an increasing reliance on freelancers on the payroll for employee, as payroll for employed creative staff was reduced, and the local authority is the landlord and gives a large subsidy to the theatre. The theatre was successful in both rounds of the Arts Council emergency funding and has developed a digital series which has been working with emerging creatives during the coronavirus lockdown. While nearly everyone was furloughed initially, the emergency funding has brought back outreach and marketing teams. And then the final lens through which we're going to view these four scenarios is we've called Arts Centre. And this is a community arts centre built in the 90s, which serves a medium-sized town, has two spaces, a 400-seat auditorium and a 100-seat studio. The local authority owns and operates the theatre and provides a small subsidy to keep it running. There's currently a discussion in the council to cut the subsidy completely. The programme is mostly tribute acts and comedy with the occasional family show. The loss of this year's panto will be catastrophic. The theatre did receive cultural recovery funding, but having seen what comparable theatres have received, don't think they applied for enough. The staff were reassigned by the council when the theatre was closed, and there's only one theatre manager still working in there. So these are all kind of our characters. We'll come back to them as I talk about the four different scenarios in detail. So I'll keep referring back to this grid, which is kind of the basis of our scenario worlds. Then the first scenario that we'll look at in detail is risky business. So risky business is the world where the audience are not keen to return, but the restrictions have been lifted. So the issue here is that performers are really keen to perform, but the big shows can't reach the kind of viable levels of capacity. There's high insurance costs and low audience numbers, so producers are not very confident about bringing larger shows around. The fact that there hasn't been shows for so long means that a lot of the small shows, the one person and small productions that are cheaper to mount, are very keen to be booked, but the running costs of organisations are kind of weighed up. The running costs of these shows are weighed up on each occasion. There's no further sector support, and so as theatres are fully open, but theatres are in an extremely perilous position. The reserves are low, and debt repayment is on the horizon for those who took out a loan to kind of help with the cash flow during this period of time. So if we look at what this means for our grand theatre, the idea here is that the absence of available large-scale product that would warrant opening this large theatre and cover the costs of doing so have meant that, except when the big shows do come, the theatre remains empty. There's an impact there on how audience development can happen, and also there's a concern that the older demographic of this particular theatre are the least willing to return. So they're having to rethink their programming completely around who are the people who are willing to return. So it's a kind of a reassessment of who the audience for that theatre is. For our Playhouse, which is the producing theatre, the productions have all been scaled back dramatically to reduce the production costs, and are scheduled for a lower break even. It's challenging for freelancers, as many have now left the sector, and for new careers, it's challenging to find the freelancers because many have left the sector for new jobs, and they're not sure that returning to the theatre is a sensible move because it's still extremely perilous. The artistic director is concerned about the impact scaling back the productions will have on the reputation of the organisation and how they can maintain continuing to be kind of a credible artistic organisation. Then the Arts Centre perspective of this is that, well, one-nighters continue to be available because they're kind of cheaper to run, and the theatre can only offer box office splits, but the promoters are willing to take it. Some people who used to travel from further afield to see shows are now looking to see what's available locally now instead. So a key thing we saw coming out of the risky business scenario, as we discussed it with different people, is what's the impact on people's willingness to travel. And the opportunity that exists in risky business is, how do you refocus your marketing and audience development to attract a local audience who might have travelled to London to see a show but aren't as willing to travel as they might have been before, and how do you kind of reach them in a new way? So the next one that I'll be looking at is a fast return. So the basics of the fast return here are vaccines being distributed quite rapidly, and it's leading to a universal lifting of restrictions. Audiences are really hungry for theatre. The first shows that open get a big boost, specifically because people are desperate to kind of see their friends and begin and go back to theatre as they did before. The risk that exists here is about how overexposed organisations might be to a risk of any kind of future lockdown. Theatres might have exhausted reserves over the past months, and then be in a position where, if there's any kind of unexpected closure, then they could be extremely exposed. Future lockdowns and a future lockdown due to a mutation or any kind of concerns about the safety of theatres would be catastrophic. There's pressure on theatres that receive subsidy to find other forms of income, because local authorities and central government arts council funding is under a lot of pressure to look to pay off the large accumulated debts over the last year, and there's also a challenge about how quickly you can pull that programming together. There's a feeling amongst some that with a fast return, some of the change that certainly people in the kind of creatives and freelancers within the sector were expecting hasn't happened, and there's also a risk here about how inclusive your fast return is, and how are you leaving behind a demographic who are still potentially finding themselves at risk and unable to engage in the theatre. So to look at this as like kind of the easiest way to make sense of these is usually through the lens of our cast of characters. The receiving theatre, the Grand Theatre, it has a full 2021 schedule because of all of the rescheduled shows, and week-long bookings have been in for quite a long time. But the speed of this returns means that some of the big shows that were penciled in are not going to be ready for the first 3 to 6 months. And it's very much dependent on how confident the producers are that they are going to get that return on these shows, and that the fast return is secure. And there's and as I said earlier, there's a kind of a boost for those theatres who can be the first to return. And so having that plan in place for what do we do when we get that green light, even if our intended programme is not available. The Playhouse model have discussed that they have many shows kind of sat ready to go on stage, and even the kind of larger national portfolio organisations have said there's not they're going to have to pause the amount of development that they do next year in order to stage all of the productions that that are ready to go, because of the as I mentioned, the kind of the pressures on subsidy. They're going to need to be looking at new ways of finding that revenue, and it might be that they continue to explore digital in a different way to try and supplement that approach. And this is the theatre that kind of most heavily feels that burden of the freelancers' perspective, that the organisation hasn't changed enough, or that there's a power imbalance between theatres and freelancers, something that was emerging prior to this shutdown. But I think certainly in the way that funding has been distributed, some of that has been reinforced, and certainly a very sensitive area for those organisations that are so reliant on creative freelancers. And then the challenge in the fast return for the smaller arts centre is those shows which were the cornerstone of their programme are now able to play larger venues, and so the challenge of how they find the kind of the top quality programming because of this kind of rush to get everything to stage as quickly as possible. The box office splits that they're able to offer aren't as attractive anymore because the gross potential of larger venues is more attractive, and the theatres are booking. The other thing to think about from a local authority perspective is how quickly staff can be reassigned back to the theatre. In many cases, local authority staff haven't been made redundant as such, but have been reassigned to different departments and may be involved in delivering test centres and these sorts of things, and vaccine centres. So when will those staff come back, and how has the relationship been maintained? And this is the thing to consider across all of the different theatres, really, is how do you address the staffing of your organisation from a kind of a position of being ready to go again? A lot of theatres staff will have been furloughed this entire time and will need re-inducting to the organisation. A lot of theatres management will have been working flat out for a year, and to suddenly kind of ramp up to a fast return and back to business as usual and 6 shows a week is going to be a big burden on them. And how do you prevent the burnout of these people who've been working flat out in in the meantime. So this is, I think, in the fast return, the consideration of staffing is a really key one. So the next one, and do feel free to ask questions as you go. I'm keeping an eye in case anybody comes up with any. The next one is the long haul. Great. So the long haul is a challenging one for organisations, and the way that we've kind of couched the positivity and the opportunity that lies within here is about reimagining what that civic role of the theatre is. And it might be that in the medium term, organisations need to expand their offering broader than just the theatre offering in order to be able to protect that theatre for the longer run. We'll be looking at this in a bit more detail in a seminar in January, where we'll be looking at the role that theatres have played in their communities over the course of the crisis, and I'll do a bit of a plug at the end for those upcoming seminars. But in the long haul, there's mutations and outbreaks that are leaving theatres in a perpetual limbo of reopening and closing. And it might be a while before fuller audiences are possible. Producing theatres consider whether having to consider the kind of the cost of the running costs of their premises, and whether that's continued to be viable. And theatres are creating work to be both live and digital, unsure on whether they're actually going to be able to perform it. Something that the recent West End shutdown has certainly brought about, with a lot of those shows now becoming digital shows, and the Royal Court's live newspapers doing that, and the National Theatre's pantomime, of course. So yeah, this is a world in which you have that in mind as you're producing these shows, of will it be live and digital simultaneously. And organisations in the long haul remain on a precipice, and the point is, and the board are getting very involved with considering the organisation solvency at every meeting, and calculating through kind of a reverse stress testing approach how long their organisation might have. So at the Grand Theatre, it's about repurposing, it's about offering the building up to creative organisations to utilise the space to create other works, maybe digital or TV work, but the costs of operating the building continue to be quite onerous. And the board are exploring different uses for the building in a non-performance sense over the medium term, in order to protect it until theatre can resume. The art centres are looking at outdoor performances and different ways of doing work outside of their building. Shows are designed to be jointly live and digital, as I discussed earlier. And the thing to consider across the long haul is not just the fact that it will be a challenging period of time for theatre, but with this combination of scenarios, with the unconfident public and concern about the and concern about and high levels of restrictions, could be accompanied by a large economic downturn as well. So the impact of that has on public spending will impact those organisations heavily reliant on subsidy. And then the Arts Centre view is that the Arts Centre is now a hall for hire. It doesn't have dedicated theatre staff. The building is maintained, but it is a kind of a village hall model here, where at the lowest possible cost, the building doesn't have a public profile, doesn't have a scheduled programme of events, but is a hall for hire for community use. But yeah, that's and kind of sadly kind of a position that a lot of the smaller local authority theatres are kind of finding themselves treading towards now. So there's one final scenario that I'm going to introduce to you now. I'm trying to paint a picture in each of these for you to understand that these are worlds that we'd like for you to consider, but I don't want it to appear I think, as I said earlier, it's very important to search for the opportunities within them and not just see them as kind of harbingers of doom. The negotiating the system one, I think, is a really interesting future scenario, because it's about how you can be innovative in your work in order to work with, in order to work with the different restrictions that are in place and yet still deliver something. So there's so the negotiating system world is where there's almost a kind of a feeling of rebels of people wanting to do creative work, but not being able to under the level of restrictions that are in place. So it's about thinking about how your organization could do different things, do larger shows which might take place over the whole building, or do more outdoor work. So this is a realm of kind of bigger shows, but less often perhaps, and those sorts of things, in order to be able to operate at probably restrictions of 50% capacity or something like that. In this realm, it's conceivable that because theatres will be kind of maybe unique in continuing to be restricted where this scenario exists, then there may be some additional government support available to create work in innovative ways. But the way your organisation might change is about shifting the risk models so that the theatre operates on a very light basis and then is able to scale up whenever there's a bigger production in the offing. Theatres don't have a trouble selling tickets when they're able to put shows on, because audiences are desperate to return. But understanding the viability of each performance is key. Innovation is required to make sure cost-effective performances work under the restrictions. This model is challenging for the Grand Theatre, which is a larger theatre and its model is built around having a lot of people under the roof at the same time and making money off the food and drink from those sales. Capacity limits are making the big shows unviable, and the theatres, and because the theatre is larger and kind of an important part of the wider area, they're under close scrutiny to be compliant with the rules. This theatre kind of needs to find new ways of covering its maintenance and insurance costs if it's been previously covering those with surplus at the box office. Innovate. Oh dear, I've lost my slides there. We go. Innovating in the Playhouse, the producers, is kind of the sorts of thing I was talking about. Finding new ways of working socially distanced around your building, looking at large outdoor and digital work to provide audience with content alongside continuing to operate in the building in new ways. And then the final one is the Arts Centre. And now, to be clear, I'm not calling the venue team rogues here. This is about the users here, and restrictions making the team here, the local authority-led team, very the restrictions are very strict upon them because they're a local authority-run venue. But there's a view that some community groups might want to use the venue and be a little bit more relaxed about the rules than the theatre management would like. And this Arts Centre needs to understand how it's going to kind of manage the expectations of its users in being able to allow them to operate in the building, but kind of it's going to be a battle with them about how they comply with those restrictions and make it happen. So those are our four worlds that we are encouraging theatres to look through their planning through the lens of. They are, as I say, they're a starting point. They're to allow theatres to reflect on multiple possible futures, but we're not specific experts on your specific theatre's operating style or context, then it's unlikely that any of these will be directly applicable. You could take our proposed axes and look at the willingness of audiences to attend and easing of restrictions, and then apply your own four scenarios on top of that. Or you might want to change one of the axes. Certainly some of the receiving theatres we were talking to were more interested in the sentiment amongst producers than they were necessarily about the audience alone, and they thought that the sentiment of producers kind of captured the audience demand, and so that would have been a more relevant axis for them. So basically what we're trying to lay out here is this is a way of thinking about your planning to make sure that you can challenge the assumptions that underlie your business plans and don't work towards one likely future, and instead consider what if it's one of these kind of very divergent situations that we end up in. What is our business planning resilient enough to face that? So the first step we would recommend is with your senior team sitting down and creating your scenarios. Tell them as stories. It might be that you assign one to each person to create, or you might just work around a table. In the old world, I'd definitely have got the post-it notes out and had a kind of a session about this, but there are other ways to collaborate now, which you might have to find digitally to make this work. Certainly, sort of, there's a lot of whiteboarding pieces of online software and things like that, which are very useful for that kind of work. And then once you've developed those worlds, as I say, we're not asking you to fully flesh out a business plan for all four, but it's about asking the key questions about about how these scenarios might affect your organizational business plan, your risk register, and if one of those scenarios comes true, does it make one of your programs impossible, or are there new things that you might want to focus on that might emerge? There's two ways of looking at it. There's taking your existing business plan and kind of putting it in a wind tunnel and testing it against these ideas, throwing these ideas at your business model and seeing how it responds. But there's also going, how far down the road do we need to be towards the long haul before parts of our business plan need to change completely? And so identifying where the triggers lie on the path towards each of these things in order to understand when you might make a change to your organizational business plan, rather than having to reassess the entire business plan and approach every single time there's a change in regulation and the condition that you're working in. Some of the key questions to ask about is how this each of those scenarios will affect your relationships. So it might be your relationship with your audience, your relationship with your producing partners, your funders. Also about how it might affect your financial position. Where do those risks lie financially in each of those worlds? And you can ask a bigger question of, what do we want our organization to be in each of these worlds? What do we do, and how are we defined? If somebody was to say, oh yeah, that theatre is something at the heart of community, and that might shape the way that you plan to survive any of these scenarios. So that's a real primer on scenario planning and the 4 base scenarios that we're recommending as a kind of a starting point for organizations to have a look at. There's a downloadable document, which I think you all will have received in advance, which lays all of these things out, and I'd certainly recommend that you have a kind of a flick through that and take what you think is relevant out of it and use it. The one thing I would suggest is, if you think one of these scenarios is not plausible or is not useful or doesn't kind of challenge your organization, reflect on why that is and what elements of it you think are implausible, because it could, for one, help you build a more relevant scenario, but also could help you uncover an assumption that about your audience that you've made and which might need testing. Certainly, when we started this out, we were talking about assumptions that people had around the demographics of their audience and the impact that would have on their willingness to return. And certainly, some of the respondents to it said that actually their oldest audience were the most keen to return, and it was people slightly younger than that who were a little bit more reticent about returning. So it's all about challenging assumptions, this approach, and we'd recommend kind of a storytelling way of understanding your business planning through the lens of these scenarios. So that's in a nutshell what I'm going to tell you about scenario planning, but I wanted to talk briefly about other things that might be useful for you when you're fleshing those out. We've previously run seminars on managing organizations in financial distress and on reopening stories and on insurance, three kind of key issues that may impact on your organization's future plans. All of those are available on the website now as recordings. And there's 3 more seminars planned for the new year, which we think will help you interpret some best practice examples. The first is about your relationship with audiences, the ways that people have put shows on during this time in the face of restrictions could give you some ideas in the negotiating the system scenario, where people have found ways to make things work, and certainly and how that's happened, and how we can make sure that we continue to be inclusive in the creation of work and making sure that we are making work as accessible as possible. Then there's a session about theatre's role in the community and about the civic role of theatres, which I spoke about earlier. And finally, we're going to have a session on what theatres need to reflect on as a business, some of those ideas about mental health for your workforce, but also what adapting to digital might mean for your organisation, and those sorts of kind of those internal things about how we need to change in order to have the capabilities to do that. So the dates and details for that are now live on the Theatres Trust homepage, so you can go and see if you're available for those. All of those will be recorded, like this one, so you can come back later and have a look afterwards. But yeah, I'd plug those as very useful ways of going. So that's me kind of wrapping up there. I just want to check to see if there's any questions people have about the approach. We're very aware this is the starting point of the journey, and I'm happy to have kind of one-to-one discussions with anybody who wants to flesh it out. I note that we haven't done anything, we didn't use amateur theatre as one of our cast of characters, but I think there's approaches here that are very valuable from that perspective. And so if that's of use, then do get in touch and we can try and kind of flesh something out in that respect. And yeah, we'll continue to evolve this. And if do let us know if you do use these scenarios and if they're useful and how you've changed them, because we might run a session further down the line to help people along the next steps towards it. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to wrap up there. I'm going to thank you all very much for attending. Our seminar series are only possible thanks to funding from the Garfield Weston Foundation, which we're very grateful for, and I hope to see you soon at our next seminars, and wish you happy holidays.